The body is miraculously adapted for the right kind of stress. And there are just myriad examples of that. Crying is an adaptive response to emotional dysregulation. It's actually pulling us back to homeostasis, to psychological and parasympathetic homeostasis. The more that I started to discover how the body is engineered for adaptive responses to stress, the more I began to apply this kind of me search to my own reality and started to experiment with all sorts of different kinds of stress.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. So glad that you are here. You know, we all want to live the cush life, right? We want to lay back and just sort of enjoy the ride. But as it turns out, that may not necessarily be in our best interest. We're told, that, for example, that we have to avoid stress. Well, as it turns out, a low level of stress of many different types turns out to have some positive physiological benefits. We call this hormesis, when a low-grade stressful activity has good effects on our physiology. So we can employ this notion of engaging good stress in our bodies to actually help us with our health, to regain, for example, better control over our blood sugar and our blood pressure. And in fact, there's a book that goes by the name of Good Stress, written by our guest today on the program, Jeff Krasno, written along with his wife, Schuyler Grant. And Jeff explores this notion of hormesis, how we can engage good stress, threatening our bodies by increasing our exposure to cold and heat, by exercise, by depriving ourselves of food for a given period of time each day, and even fasting, by exposing ourselves to light, because these activities are good for us. Let me tell you a little bit more about Jeff Krasno. Jeff is the CEO and founder of Commune Media, a masterclass platform for well-being that features renowned authors and teachers. He hosts the Commune podcast, which has over 520 episodes and generates more than 750,000 monthly downloads, featuring interviews with luminaries such as Deepak Chopra, Marianne Williamson, Matthew McConaughey, Gabor Mate, and I have to admit, I have been a guest on that podcast as well. Additionally, Jeff writes a weekly commusing essay exploring well-being, spirituality, and culture, and distributed to an email list of over 1 million subscribers. Prior to founding Commune Media, Jeff co-created Wanderlust, a global series of wellness events that have significantly contributed to popularizing yoga practices and principles in the United States and beyond. In 2016, Oprah Winfrey selected him as part of the Super Soul 100, recognizing him as one of the nation's leading entrepreneurs. I, as mentioned, had the opportunity to spend some time with Jeff at Commune, recorded one of his masterclass programs, this one dedicated to brain health, and I'm very delighted to welcome Jeff to our podcast today. Well, hello, Jeff Krasno. Good to see you again.
Dr. David Perlmutter, what a treat. I love being with you.
The last time we saw each other was at Eudaimonia in West Palm, but before that was when I was recording up there at the Commune with you. And in Topanga, how are things up there now?
Well, really through just the heroics of the people on the front lines, the first responders in the LAFD, we've just skated by the skin of our teeth up there. Yeah, those brave souls were able to hold the line just south of town, for those familiar with our little canyon up there. And yeah, man, I mean, it was obviously a very tumultuous and stressful time for all of us here in Los Angeles, and candidly for everyone experiencing it through their phones, etc.
Yeah, to me, it's really interesting just to conceive of the disconnect between what we are doing in the country and in the world, and the fact that these climatological events are becoming much more aggressive, and there's no connection between our day-to-day activities, seemingly, and the production of the issues that relate to climate change that end up being hurricanes that destroy Asheville, North Carolina, or fires in Southern California. I mean, it's very obvious to some, but not to all.
Yeah. Well, of course, you're no stranger to environmental catastrophe, right? Where you are. And yeah, I do feel like there is this moment of disconnection. Of course, we're speaking just in the alpenglow of the inauguration of a new president. And there are those within our community who are very hopeful that there might be some positive changes as it relates to physiological human health. But there seems to be a significant disconnect between that and planetary health. And of course,
Yeah.
I can't help but separate or not separate the two. So, yeah, it's an interesting moment. And, humans are often propelled and motivated by crisis. And now I'm scratching my head and asking myself, well, what level of rock bottom must we hit in order to adapt and our behavior?
Yeah. Well, you say, we have hope. And I'm often reminded of the quote from movie director James Cameron, who said that hope is not a strategy. All well and good to hope,
That's
but
right. Yeah.
boots on the ground, right? The other
Yeah.
thing I find so fascinating, certainly we see it here in Florida and the sentiment in Asheville, North Carolina. And I suspect that's what we're seeing in California, from the news reports, is that the sentiment of, oh, it's not going to get us down, we're going to come back strong and rebuild. Well, maybe that's not exactly the right idea. Maybe continuing to build in harm's way is not exactly what we should be doing, and should be thinking of relocating to less threatening environments as an appropriate course of action.
Yeah, 100%. Of course, one of the great attractions of California is its natural splendor and the ability to essentially live in a thriving urban environment while also availing yourself of significant nature, right? So, a lot of houses and residential areas are built up into what is known as the Huey, right? The sort of foothills where there's a tremendous amount of vegetation, and in our case here, a tremendous amount of dry chaparral, which
Right.
essentially serves as tinder. And of course, you'd be hard pressed not to connect that with human behavior and the ramifications of environmental change, in response to human behavior. So, we seem to be going kind of in these cyclical patterns here in California through periods of extreme drought, where we will not see rain for upwards of a year sometimes. And then we'll have very, very, very significant rains. And of course, you can look in essentially every system, including human physiology, the sort of pressing towards extremes generally reveals imbalance and disease. If you
Right.
could make that argument both for planetary and human health, and that's what we're seeing here. So I agree. I mean, we have this opportunity, I suppose, to think through how we're going to quote unquote build back. And yeah, I agree with you. I hope that um, we can think through it intelligently.
Well, in visiting you in Topanga when I recorded it at Commune, I remember, and the topic of our discussion today, our purpose of getting together, is to talk about your book, and of course, talk about the upsides of stress in terms of physiology and wellness. And I recall that you asked me you had a schedule for me to record virtually the whole day, which required kind of getting an early start. I walked up the mountain a little bit and got in the recording studio, and I was freezing. I couldn't even speak. And so luckily we ended up doing that segment at the end of the day when I was feeling a lot warmer. But I guess in retrospect, you probably designed it that way because you knew that would be good for me. The cold exposure, it was challenging. I could barely talk. But anyway, um, you write this book about stress, and most of us, or a lot of us, think that we just want to live, as I said in the introduction, the cush life. We just want to
Mm.
go easily down the road and just enjoy every minute, not have anything that's bothering us. But you really come to a really important place of indicating that various types of stresses to our bodies ultimately play out as being positive, enhancing physiology and really making us resilient. And I think that's a very important watchword for us, central word for us. And I think in our conversation moving forward, you begin your book by talking about the dream, about how, why we can't live to be, I think it was 118 and or even longer. That's the dream. That's what we hear about. So many of the people that appear on this podcast, who you've interviewed as well, talk about anti-aging, or at least longevity, in terms of living longer or living better through our years, expanding the health span, if not the lifespan. So then you confront that with the reality of what we are currently experiencing. So if you could just spend a moment on the dream and then counter that with the reality, that'll segue us nicely into the notion of what I introduced, this notion of hormesis, stressing our bodies to some degree, and how that has positive attributes for us.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, I have three daughters, and I read voluminously to them as they were, when their bedtime was before mine. Now that's flipped around, of course. They're all teenagers. But yeah, I would read a lot of the classic books, the Chronicles of Narnia and The Witch of Blackbird Pond and all, Island of the Blue Dolphins, etc. And a lot of fairy tales that often involved, some scullery maid that would get three wishes at the end or something. And so my youngest daughter, Micah, I remember one night she asked me, "Well, Daddy, if you were a prince, what would be your wish?" And she kind of stumped me. At the moment, my wish was just let me go to sleep.
I wish you'd
But
stop asking questions
yeah,
like
totally.
that.
Just, um, but eventually I had an answer for her, and to paraphrase, I told her that, well, um, Mike, a long time from now, my dream, my wish is that, your mommy and I will walk up to our summer cabin when we're 118 years old. We'll be celebrating our a centennial together. And it's not unfathomable. We've been together for 36 years. And, we'll have this wonderful dinner and we'll cuddle up in bed and we'll die on the same day. And it's just completely okay. And we will die without kind of the hallmarks of aging, the decrepitude, the cognitive decline. Um, and, really just embrace our fate as just links in this continuous chain of captured sunlight and then degrade back from which we came and, through, mycelium and fungi kind of decay back into the earth and give back everything that we've extracted, all the wonderful nitrogen and carbon and phosphorus, etc. And her being 5 or 6 years old at that time, she didn't perceive this to be in the least bit morose or morbid. She just gave me a big hug, and she understood that this was a beautiful dream. And I know she wished it possible for me and her mother. Um, and it's a little Pollyanna, perhaps a little maudlin to think that death should be so unproblematic in this day and age. At the same time, it's just crazy that we've accepted what I call kind of sick expectancy now. That there is this crazy distension of morbidity that lasts 15, 20, 25 years, in which most of us are enduring multiple chronic diseases, often, taking a cocktail of pharmaceuticals that treat, just the symptoms, but never the root cause. And there's so many downstream negative impacts to that. I mean, obviously, the pain and suffering of the individual, but as I'm sure you're acutely aware, that radiates out to friends and family who often need to give care for 10, 15, 20 years. Obviously, there's the massive societal expense. I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of GDP, essentially spent on sick care. So I think $4.5 trillion, more or less. I think if we continue on this trajectory, we'll be somewhere in the $10 trillion range by the year 2040. And you don't have to be a mathematician to understand what that's going to do to our economy. So there's so much of this. I really think, not to dwell on politics, but that there is a direct relationship between what sometimes I refer to as inflammation in the human body and inflammation in the body politic. I think there's a bidirectional relationship there. Is that if you wake up with multiple chronic diseases on a minimum wage job and you can't afford your statins and your insulin and your metformin, et cetera, you're likely going to be fairly angry, and justifiably, because you feel like the social contract has let you down, and that essentially might contribute to more extreme kind of political views and behavior. So there's so many aspects of this epidemic that we really just need to tackle as a society. So, to just kind of bookend that, I mean, I have always been in the wellness industry, if you will, but I discovered that I was actually part of the chronic disease nightmare about 5 years ago. And that really propelled me on this quest to unpack the etiology of chronic disease, kind of more from a citizen scientist perspective. You have a lot of people with letters at the end of their name on your show. I don't have one of
The
those.
more letters, I think, the worse. But go ahead.
It's funny because I used to quake in the sight of a white coat, and of course now I want to wear one. But yeah, so this quest to kind of understand the nature of disease was born out of curiosity, but candidly for me was really born out of necessity, and it's been a fascinating awakening for me to better understand kind of the nature of the human condition and why we're so sick.
This is a fairly common theme I find doing a podcast in terms of people that I interview, that they reach an epiphany of a health crisis, and it propels them to ask why and to dig deeper in terms of not just wanting to deal with the smoke or the manifestation of what's going on, but identify the fire and then figure out what they can do to ameliorate that situation. I guess we're talking about fire yet again.
Yeah.
Having said that, as is the case for you, one of the things that, or I think a powerful input into disability is lack of engaging ourselves or stressing ourselves, engaging ourselves in stressful situations or confrontations in many different ways. And so, well, hi everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. We hope you're enjoying this content, and if you would do so, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to our channel, please consider doing so. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community, so let's get right back to the presentation. How did you get to this notion of stress being necessarily in a form good, as juxtaposed upon the traditional perception of stress as always being something we should avoid at all costs?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is a distillation, candidly, from being able to marinate the wisdom with the wisdom of brilliant people like yourself and many of your colleagues. And I've had that opportunity to host people in Topanga and on my podcast. And in a way, this book is sort of a squeezing of that sponge. But, I really had to take a deep personal biopsychosocial inventory of my life and really examine who I was kind of with a greater degree of honesty. So I was living for many years kind of I think from wine, or I should say from coffee to wine o'clock, if you will. I think that's a fairly um, familiar phenomenon, and I was experiencing these presentations, physical presentations and psychological presentations that are historically incredibly abnormal, but we have completely normalized them. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to this. So brain fog, chronic fatigue, insomnia, irritability, the inability to concentrate, the need to check your phone all the time. That's some of the more psychosocial components. And then, of course, there were plenty of insults to my vanity as well. I had kind of what you might call dad bod, so a sort of layer of kind of visceral adiposity kind of in the middle. And I started growing these kind of strange brown skin tags in kind of my armpits. And I know some people get them on the back of their neck. And I subsequently began to understand that those were kind of early signs of insulin resistance. And then, of course, the gynecomastia, which is sort of the clinical nice word for man boobs. This was one of the insults that my children love to levy on me. And they'd be like, not necessarily A cups, Dad.
But in a loving way.
In a loving way. So, but of course, all of these symptoms are so anodyne. They're so commonplace now in modern society that we can essentially just write them off of like, oh, I'm just having a bad day, But really, these were very, very rare presentations, 100 years ago. And obviously, our hunter-gatherer ancestors never experienced these kinds of presentations. So, I really had to understand that many of these symptoms really are just barely upstream from what we label disease. So there's a particularly metabolic disease and metabolic dysfunction, which was what I was unwittingly dealing with. And it wasn't until I actually put a continuous glucose monitor on my triceps that I got a bucket of cold water, which I say it was not a deliberate protocol at the moment, poured over my head. It was just an awakening. I had 125 milligrams per deciliter fasting blood glucose.
Wow.
So that's on the very highest end of pre-diabetes, kind of lowest end of diabetes. And I would get these postprandial spikes to 250, 300 on the regular.
Yeah.
So something really, really had to change. And that kind of spurred me on my journey to discover what I call these good stress protocols. Because as you say, I was essentially part of kind of modernity's engineering for incessant ease and comfort. And this is what culture has done since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly accelerating in the last 50 to 70 years, is at every turn, we often in the name of corporate profit, candidly, we have engineered our lives for incessant comfort, whether that's the kind of always available surfeit of shelf stable nutrient deficient calories, or whether that's sort of the snuggly 72-degree thermoneutral living room, or the kind of the incessant access to entertainment through our various devices, to comfy chairs and comfy shoes. At every turn, we've essentially hijacked our biology. And what I began to learn was that the body is miraculously adapted for the right kind of stress. And there are just myriad examples of that, David. Some that I keep actually stumbling over. Though there is an interesting one that's actually not in the book, but crying, for example, is an adaptive response to emotional dysregulation. And it's really fascinating, actually, as I started to get into this. This is recent, so it's kind of front of mind. But we have these lacrimal glands in our eyes that produce a certain amount of like basal tears that just kind of keeps our eyes lubricated. And then I was actually cutting onions this morning because I'm making something for dinner for my kids. And that's just reactive tears. But then humans have these unique emotional tears. And if you actually examine the chemistry of these tears, what you will find is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's a stress hormone. So crying is literally an adaptive response to stress. It's actually pulling us back to homeostasis, to psychological and parasympathetic homeostasis. It also forces us to to gasp, right? To take deep breaths. Of course, that's another tool that we have at our disposal when we use it consciously to essentially mitigate and deal with stress. So, it's just the more that I started to discover how the body is engineered for adaptive responses to stress, the more I began to um, apply this kind of me search to my own reality, and started to experiment with all sorts of different kinds of stress.
So again, what you just said, I think is very important, that there's positivity for our physiology to the adaptive response to stress that we can force. We can force the issues. We can force ourselves to experience the stress, initiate that adaptive response, which is positive. That's really the book in a nutshell. And then, of course, we're going to walk through what does it actually mean? How do we implement? But there are a couple of things you said I wanted to comment on. And first, this notion of the normalizing of poor health, basically, of obesity, of hypertension, and certainly of elevated blood sugar, if not frank diabetes. And, we tend to think that what is most common is normal. The middle of the bell curve is defined as being normal when we look at large population sets. That's how laboratory studies have worked. A large number of people have a blood sugar evaluation, and they figure out, well, what's within one standard deviation of the mean, and that's going to be what we use to define normal. It doesn't work anymore. We ought to be defining what is optimal, as you well learned when you looked at your blood sugar on your continuous glucose monitor. When we see that, some 83 to 86% of American adults now is either pre-diabetic or diabetic, it's hard to imagine that we should therefore consider that to be pretty much normal. It's very common, that's for sure, but it really instructs us then to stop equating commonality with normality. And that's a huge pit that we fall into, and it's reinforced by media. Just look at the television commercials, for example, for diabetes drugs. These are people who are overweight and in the commercial are eating crap, and yet they take their shot or their pill. And next thing you know, they've got an A1C. My A1C is below 7. Well, having an A1C below 7 is not a good move. We've got to do a hell of a lot better than that. But they set this arbitrary metric that's easy to achieve when you're using your GLP-1 agonist or metformin or sulfonylurea, whatever it may be. If you can get your A1C below 7, problem solved. Stay on the drug. And what I think is so important for people to understand, and that is that these drugs are not treating diabetes. We don't have drugs to treat high blood pressure. We don't have drugs to treat Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. We have drugs to treat the symptoms of these maladies. We have drugs that'll treat the rigidity and the tremor of Parkinson's. Take the drug away and those problems return because we haven't addressed the underlying problem. You stop your diabetes medication, and sure enough, in a couple of days, that blood sugar is going to go way back up, if not higher than it would have been. Same thing with high blood pressure. So we're treating the symptoms, we're treating the smoke and ignoring the fire. And I think that when we engage the lifestyle changes that you are discussing in your book, now we are attacking the metabolic issues, the dysregulated physiology, and we're actually, for the very first time, approaching the fire and really putting the fire out such that the symptoms no longer manifest. And I think, what you've done in your book is here's the keys to the kingdom. These are the tools. I know you break it down into 10 large categories, but here's how to make it happen. And it really challenges us. I mean, even the title of your book, Good Stress, for most people, that's going to sound like an oxymoron. Because what do you mean good stress? I've been told that I have to limit stress in my life because it's bad. But, I want to go to first, then, or second, or I don't know where we are. I've been keeping count. But
It's okay.
where are we in terms of the tenets of your book from an evolutionary perspective? How do we get back to speaking to our genome by stressing ourselves physically, emotionally, etc.? And you talk about emotional stress by socialization or lack thereof. We talk about physiological stress by time restricted eating or fasting. And of course, the physical stresses you talk about by heat exposure, cold exposure, etc. But how does that relate evolutionarily to how we confront our physiology in contrast to how we're uh, signaling our physiology today by our very comfortable life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, evolution is awfully slow, David. We're essentially, quote unquote, wearing the same genes, if you will, as our hunter gatherer ancestors. And, human beings evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And then we have our hominid ancestors evolved over millions of years, right? And one thing that's very important to realize, and of course the Buddha spoke to this without the luxury of you know, of technology, is that we are completely interdependent with our environment. So this genome that I'm lucky to have evolved in relationship to its environment over unfathomable swaths of time. And it evolved adaptive mechanisms in relation to certain Paleolithic stressors, right? So, your friend Rick Johnson, for example, and you've written about this too, says, nature wants us to be fat, right? So it's completely adaptive to put on a nice little layer of fat in the late summer and the early fall. Why? Because for hundreds of thousands of years, winter's paucity was just around the corner, right? So our bodies were preparing for a dearth of calories. But of course, now we live in a world where winter never comes, right? We can, in the palm of our hand, on a whim, order up any type of food stuff that would get here to my front door by the end of this
And
podcast,
you don't
right?
even have to get off the couch.
No, you
You
don't have
just
to do
have to
anything.
pick up your iPhone and, well, you have to walk to the front door.
Yeah, you have to walk to the front door.
You remember the movie
That's
WALL-E?
it. Oh,
Yeah,
I've been
that's who
so influenced by it. Yeah.
we're becoming. But go ahead.
Yeah. So, but if you look at the right amount of nutrient deficiency, for example, which we used to endure as part of winter's fallow, right? That actually activated all of these pathways that conferred resilience and longevity and
Survivability. Yeah.
and survivability. So obviously it balanced caloric intake. So if we put on a little bit of extra fat in the fall, obviously we would lean down, but it was much more sophisticated than that. Obviously there's the activation of all these certain pathways. I'm sure there's been many people on your show that have spoke very eloquently to, AMPK and these processes of like autophagy, cleaning up senescent cells in the body and reducing dysfunctional proteins to their component building blocks. And then, the body miraculously uses those amino acids to build back new functional proteins. Well, that's happened in reaction to a certain amount of good stress, right? So, and that's really important. There's also other forms of like mitochondrial upregulation in relation to the right amount of nutrient deficiency. So, and you can kind of go on and on and on with like, so in the modern age, because there is a surfeit of available calories, what do we need to do? We need to self impose these conditions of Paleolithic life, and we call that intermittent fasting or some form of fasting. And really, all it's really doing is aligning our behavior with our engineering, period. That's really what's happening there. And the more wise we get about how we're designed, the more we can adapt the behaviors and the environment that allows us to essentially swim with nature's current and leverage these hard wrought adaptive mechanisms in the human body. And there's so many. I mean, what I started to really ask myself, David, most of the time is like, how did I evolve? That was like the primary question I started to ask myself. And yeah, I evolved with exposure, for example, to significant fluctuation in temperature, for example, right? So my body would get very, very hot during the blazing sun on the Serengeti. And what would it do? Well, it had a built in adaptive response to sweat, to perspire, to thermoregulate, to bring me
And
back.
to make you
Yeah.
tan.
And to make me tan. That's right. Yeah, to essentially interact with these melanocytes, in my skin to protect myself from from UVB rays, and but also to balance the right amount of vitamin D, endogenous production. I mean, all this stuff. I mean, we are like this incredible laboratory, and the more that you unpack it, the more wonder and awe is revealed in there. But of course, thermoregulation is such it's like an imprimatur for so many of the body's mechanisms, because really all it is just the body returning to homeostasis. And homeostasis is essentially the signature of health. So, your body, of course, when it got really cold, it would also thermoregulate, but in the other direction. What would you do? You would shiver, and you would use energy substrates, either glucose or fat, and your mitochondria would then make heat to bring yourself back up into that Goldilocks zone, the little warm porridge, if you will, of 98.6. And so the ironic thing here, though, is that if you don't use it, you lose it. So if we can agree that the signature of health is homeostasis, it really helps to push the edges of your body's discomfort to enhance its ability to bounce back to center.
Right. We'll call that homeostatic flexibility.
Yes, 100%.
Because our major physiologic systems exist in a state of what we call dynamic equilibrium. Equilibrium means they're going for a central point, but the important word here is dynamic, and that means it's constantly changing. And basically, we want to exercise that. We want to exercise that fluidity such that we have resilience and reserve built into the system.
100%. I mean, if you look at um, holding your breath, for example, that's a decent example. What happens kind of once you hold your breath for a minute or so? Well, eventually, you're going to get an abundance of carbon dioxide and sort of a dearth of oxygen. So that's known as hypercapnia and hypoxia at the same time. And what does your body do? Well, it has a built-in adaptive response to that stressor as well. And of course, this is why athletes train at high altitudes. But, there's these little chemoreceptors. I think they're somewhere around the carotid artery. And they will sense that phenomenon and give your body a signal to create this protein called EPO, erythropoietin, to essentially activate the production of red blood cells. And what do red blood cells do? Well, one of the things they do is usher oxygen to the cells for energy production. And if you have more of them, well, that's going to be a really good thing with a lack of oxygen, right? So also carbon dioxide manages body acidity or pH balance. So an excess of carbon dioxide, if you do like a long breath hold, for example, will make your body a tiny bit more acidic. And that acidity will lessen the affinity between hemoglobin and oxygen. So hemoglobin, of course, the protein in the red blood cells, that sort of is the courier for oxygen to the cells. And if there's less affinity there, it will let it go. And so it's really interesting that like long breath holds, for example, or training, at high altitudes, essentially some form of deliberate hypoxia actually stimulates adaptive response in the body. Again, this is a good stress. And that's why, I will practice that form of breath work, because what it really does is sort of upgrade mitochondrial function. My mitochondria gets better at making energy with slightly less oxygen. And so then that's when athletes come back to sea level, they're like, whoa, look at me go. Because essentially I've trained my body through the application of the right amount of stress. And I think that that's a key point. I think this was the Paracelsus quote that, the dose makes the poison, right? Hypoxia can be a really bad thing, right? In the wrong dose. Like hyperthermia or hypothermia can be deadly. But, on the edge of that discomfort, the body really begins to enhance its ability for what you call this dynamic homeostasis. I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. It's a very kind of tenuous kind of balance that the body is always keeping.
Well, interesting, just to unpack a little bit further the hypoxia. discussion. And what we're learning now, I think, is that it's not necessarily the state of being in hypoxia that triggers the best adaptation, as in, should you relocate to Denver from sea level to Mile High City or Mexico City or wherever it may be. It's more the delta. It's more, which is inducible when we do the protocols like you talk about. It's the change in oxygenation that we experience that is what really triggers something called hypoxia inducible factor 1 alpha, which, in addition to what you mentioned earlier, also enhances our transcription of something called vascular endothelial growth factor, growing
Right.
more blood vessels to give that blood to the areas of the body where those mitochondria live in the cells and need more oxygen to do the job of creating energy. So it's a long way of saying that it opens the door for us to be able to engage in the practices like you describe, as opposed to thinking we're going to do really well by being the athlete who goes to Mexico City to train for the long run. And because of the increased hemoglobin hematocrit that you would gain from having erythropoietin, or you could, I guess, dope,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
run your race. It's the change. And it really does. And I mention that because it opens the door then to day-to-day practices that we can induce hypoxia and really, lower our oxygenation of our blood and trigger these mechanisms that are sensitive to that. I mean, you have to know that your body's got a way of dealing with these things because it's what our ancestors might have experienced from time to time, or we might experience if we suddenly need to do something with a burst of energy, and we do become hypoxic. And if you really want to hold your breath a long time and become more hypoxic, the what really triggers us to have the sense that we have to breathe is not the hypoxia, it's the hypercapnia, it's the
Right.
elevated CO2, which is why, for example, if you're free diving and you see a fish way down there and you want to shoot that fish, the first thing you do on the surface is hyperventilate. You blow off as much CO2 as you can, and you calm yourself down and you maintain your oxygenation levels. Most of the time, a lot of people I know who do free diving have had the experience of, nearly blacking out on the surface, which is kind of spooky. Been there, done that. But it's the reason then for these hypoxia exercises that hyperventilation takes away the sense that you need to breathe and allows you to get even lower in terms of your oxygenation. And it's why in the world of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, it's not really looked upon anymore as being the most therapeutic thing to do by going under the highest pressure or increasing the oxygen in the chamber to 100%. It's the delta, it's the change. And that's what we're seeing more and more in protocols of hyperbaric oxygen therapy for things like cognitive decline or even long COVID. It's the variation in the oxygenation that really induces these factors that are so good for our mitochondria. So again, the stress. But I think you were leading in then to temperature and heat. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's, I think, really interesting. The delta uh, effect.
Ooh,
And
what a great name for a book.
yeah,
The
totally.
Delta Effect. I love it.
You can have, you got it.
Okay, let me get the URL when we're done.
Yeah. And this is obviously on full display with deliberate cold and heat, right? Because, we will impose a certain core body temperature change through environmental inputs, for a short period of time. So with sauna, let's say with sauna bathing, you might get into, I mean, I think the data suggests that maybe 180 to 200 degree sauna for 20 minutes. So what's happening there? Well, there's a bunch of different things. Obviously, there is a kind of cardiovascular impact happening. So, and that when you subject yourself to heat, it's sort of like a low grade, almost zone 2 mimicking exercise, right? Because your heart rate increases, right? But there's all these other things going on that is coming out in the data, for example. So it appears that there's the production of all these different kinds of proteins, like BDNF is one that I think has been fairly celebrated, this brain-derived neurotropic factor.
Celebrated. I love it.
Yeah. Um, that seems to maintain neural function and, as I understand it, even contribute to kind of neurobiogenesis, so neuroplasticity even later in life. And of course, this flies in the face of what we were taught for many, many years. There's the heat shock protein effect. So there's the development of these proteins that seem to be able to maintain the three-dimensional shape of other proteins. And, of course, this is your area of expertise. But as I understand it, there may be some correlation there between, some of these beta amyloid plaques that are sometimes associated with Alzheimer's and dementia, et cetera.
You were so diplomatic in that comment just
Yeah,
then. I
I know,
love
I
it.
know. I
I know
tried. I
where that
really
came from.
tried.
We've
I
spent
really
some time
tried.
talking. Good for you.
Yeah, yeah. um, obviously, there is some form of detox function, but I will say that is sometimes hyperbolized in the sauna. Yes, through perspiration, I think you can exude some heavy metals, but you have other systems in the body that do that primarily. Um, Certainly, there's a vasodilation component, and this when you're getting into contrast bathing between heat and cold, you will have that vasodilation in the heat, and then that vasocontraction in the cold, if you like to do that, and that will help your circulatory system and your lymph move around, etc. I also think that there's a therapeutic use in connection with pathogens in the sauna, and maybe you have a little bit more insight here because this is something that is just a guess, from me. But
Why do you
you're
guess that? Why do you guess it?
well. I think there's some famous Hippocrates quote was like, give me a fever or something like that. I can't exactly put my thumb on it, but I would say this is that the body expends a tremendous amount of energy keeping itself warm, but it kind of maxes out, around 98.6. But of course, we do have fevers, and fevers, as I would try to understand it, create an inhospitable environment for some pathogens, bacteria and viruses to exist, right? Because it's outside of their comfort zone, essentially. And so what we're doing with sauna is essentially raising our core body temperature to create an inhospitable environment for pathogens to do their nefarious duties. Is that something you would agree with?
Oh, I would, but I think that traditionally the discussion is always really centered around the upregulation of macrophage activity induced by heat, and
Hmm.
therefore the salubrious effects of elevated body temperature. Now, and so you can induce that extrinsically then by going into the sauna, and I think that what we're learning is that once again it's the delta that there's I'll characterize it by saying there's a move away from calling it heat shock protein to calling it thermal shock protein, because you can induce it with heat and you can induce it with cold, so that
Right.
it's really just the change from baseline that seems to be, again, what is salubrious about these challenges. But much of the work did start with the Swedish research demonstrating pretty significant reduction in risk of both cognitive decline as well as cardiovascular disease in individuals who use the sauna quite frequently, living in a cold environment. So then by default, they were going generally from a very cold experience to the sauna, sometimes walking through the snow and then getting into the sauna, and oftentimes would indeed cold plunge long before it was de rigueur, long before Wim Hof made it mandatory for us all. So, that said, I think looking at the delta, we don't enjoy sudden changes, sudden shifts of our comfort zone, and certainly temperature is one of them. And similarly, just hanging out and relaxing feels great, but you make a very strong case for exercise and particularly challenging our muscles. And tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, again, if you're asking yourself the question, how did I evolve? Well, I walked a lot, right? So, our hunter-gatherer ancestors would walk somewhere between 10,000 miles. I'm sorry, 7 to
Miles a day.
10,000.
They were very active.
Yeah, that was
3
7 to
days
10
around the world.
miles. 7 to 10 miles a day. I make that error because so many people associate, their physical activity with the amount of steps that they are registering on their iWatch. So you can say, 7 miles is about 14,000 steps for if you're really keeping track. So, obviously we don't have the same requirements for just general perambulation in our day and age. We tend to be quite sedentary creatures. I think 80% of Americans now have a desk job. We spend 94% of our time inside or in a car. So again, this is an evolutionary mismatch that is creating sort of a tension between how we live and how we're engineered. So, for me, I'm a big walker. I'm a big hiker.
And you live with a lot of verticality too.
I do, which of course is a signature of the blue zones too. So, but I would say that zone 2 kind of exercise. Um, Sometimes I call it the Jesus protocol, which I have dubbed Jehovah's Fitness, which is probably the worst dad joke imaginable. But you walk for 40 days in the desert, and you do a lot of fasting. A desert is not a requirement, but so I would say 4 to 5 sessions of zone 2 exercise per week, because that is very much in alignment with how we evolved. Now, of course, off there from time to time we were pressed, sometimes against our will, into a full out sprint, um, to escape a predator. And you might equate that with high intensity interval training, essentially getting your heart rate up into that zone 5, 90% of maximum heart rate or something like that. So I think it's important to do that, maybe once a week, twice a week, so if you're going to kind of balance your aerobic regimen, it seems like data is pointing us to sort of 3 or 4 sessions of zone 2, 1 or 2 sessions of zone 4 or 5 per week, and that seems to be a good balance of aerobic exercise. And then, of course, I would say probably the most obvious example in the world of good stress is muscle hypertrophy, right? So what do? You overload, let's say, a biceps for the sake of this argument. And what happens, you tear the microfibers in that muscle, and there's an inflammatory response. And what does the body do? It has an adaptive reaction to that injury, and it generates these structural proteins, actin and myosin, to then essentially go in and heal that injury. And what happens with enough rest, and provided that you're eating enough of the amino acid building blocks, the muscle gets bigger and stronger, right? And so that is like the primary number one example, probably, of sort of the Nietzschean idea of what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? And this is what we did kind of for hundreds of thousands of years. We lifted heavy things, we chopped wood, we carried water. And now in our search for comfort and ease, we tend to avoid those things, and our lives have become so denuded of discomfort that we become soft and unfortunately sick.
I think there's a move to begin to consider muscles as an endocrine gland, in that, here they are creating these chemicals that go elsewhere in the body and do good things. You mentioned BDNF earlier. Others like irisin, cathepsin D, even lactate, even acting as a neurotransmitter, a nurturing mitochondria, and certainly interleukin 6, which we used to characterize as being a pro-inflammatory myokine, or a cytokine, now also characterized as being a myokine coming from muscle. It's not just bad inflammation; it's good. It's good for our bodies to experience a level of inflammation from which we can recover. So we have built into our bodies systems for um, modifying inflammation, for recovering from inflammation. And that can be certainly accentuated by taking various types of omega-3 fatty acids that help us energize that system that tamps down inflammation, which is a cornerstone of what makes a good body go bad in the long run. But certainly having a peak of inflammation, which we get when we exercise, is a good thing. It's why there's been an argument as of late against going into the cold bath right after you exercise, because it tamps down that inflammatory surge, that surge
Right.
of interleukin 6 that you actually need, because it does good things. It is that surge of interleukin 6, by the way, that is the transmitter that activates AMP kinase to do all the cool things with respect to fat mobilization and helping us lower our blood sugar. So we don't want to tamp that down. So I think the messaging as of late is don't go into the cold plunge after you run, don't jump off the end of the dock. And that's great. I think, you're going to have to defer that. Just take a warm shower and go to the cold plunge after that.
Yeah, yeah. Open yourself up to the possibility that this short term inflammation is actually going to lead to long term gain, right? Long term adaptive inflammatory balance in the body. So I'll be sure to pass that along to Novak Djokovic. I'll be wait after your match before getting into the cold plunge. I
Well,
mean,
let me tell
most
you,
yeah.
his inflammation's got to be really low because he's gluten free. Let's call it like it is, right?
Yeah. Well, he has taken athleticism to a whole nother level. I mean, muscle hypertrophy for me was also very, very central for blood sugar regulation. I think we're learning that muscle is a glucose vacuum. Really, it's just a sink, and doesn't really require you to stress the pancreas to create insulin when you're actually contracting muscle, that it will uptake glucose without taxing the pancreas. So when I started to actually layer on a bunch of these different protocols, I just saw miraculous response with my blood sugar management. So, and really, I would say muscle hypertrophy and resistance training was the last protocol that I layered on this stack. And that's when I really saw just a complete kind of quote unquote optimization of blood sugar.
I want our viewers right now to hear what you just said, because it's really, really important. Because so many people have elevated blood sugar, or at least elevated insulin, on the way of becoming insulin resistant. And earlier on, you said, well, you were hovering, your fasting blood glucose was at 125, so you were right on the edge of going from pre-diabetic to diabetic. As if that matters, it does not. This isn't an analog, a binary system where suddenly you're diabetic and all hell breaks loose. Oh, but I'm pre-diabetic, everything is fine. It's an analog system. And, at a
Right.
fasting blood sugar of 125, you're in trouble. There's no question about it. At an A1C of 6, you're already starting to have increased risk of dementia and brain shrinkage. So, here you are actually talking about targeting the underlying problem, improving insulin functionality by layering all of these things onto your stack, not the least of which is stressing your muscles, gaining a muscle mass, because as you mentioned, it's a powerful sink for glucose. And at the same time, through this pathway of AMP kinase that won't be on the quiz, you're enhancing how insulin does its job. So,
Mhm.
what you're saying is really exciting for people, that here's a way of not ultimately taking the easy way out, which is popping a couple of metformins, or maybe bumping up your semaglutide dosage, and getting your blood metric under control, your blood sugar. That's not the answer here. Getting your blood sugar under control isn't the goal. The goal is to stop being a diabetic or pre-diabetic by engaging exactly what you're talking about here. And your book is great because it gives everybody the tools to make that happen.
Yeah, and I'm just an average dude, really. Confronting something that is unfortunately all too common, which should be uncommon. I mean, and for me, while glucose is a decent proxy for metabolic health, it's really kind of downstream from insulin. So, and that way, given my blood glucose, because you can have managed blood glucose levels, but your body can then be like churning out insulin, right?
Totally.
So while really the better metric is actually looking at insulin, it's just slightly harder molecule to commercially measure, right? So
Well, not
that,
really.
yeah,
So the take-home message for viewers: get a fasting insulin. Next time you have your blood work done, if you're not wearing a CGM and it's done, who knows how often, tell the doctor, in addition to my fasting blood glucose and my A1C, I want a fasting insulin level. Our goal is to keep that level below 8, and that can be accomplished. So, again, just to flesh out what you just said, you can have a pretty good blood glucose, but your pancreas gets you there because it's working overtime. We need to intercede at this stage because ultimately you'll become resistant to the insulin that you're producing. Then the blood sugar goes up. And that's where you found yourself. So you were already down the continuum.
totally. I mean, a lot of people understand the concept that the excess of one molecule creates a resistance to itself. A lot of people understand that through coffee or through beer, right? It's like your threshold for how many cups of coffee you need goes up.
Listen, don't go to coffee. You can't, you don't threaten me.
Okay, no, I'm
I
not.
don't even want
I'm
to
a
hear
coffee.
it.
No, I'm a coffee drinker. So, and coffee has plenty of redeeming qualities to
Of
extol.
course it does.
But
And I will vet them.
but my point here is that an excess of insulin in the human body will eventually create a resistance to itself. And so that's where I found myself, where I essentially was insulin resistant. So my cells were not happy to accept glucose or fat substrates in for the energy production. And what was it doing it instead? It was shuttling it off and storing it as fat, or worse, probably creating these kind of glycated proteins, et cetera, which can be highly inflammatory. But for me, what I began to understand is like this layer of adiposity I had around the middle was a direct product of insulin resistance. And not only that, but it was bidirectional because the more fat that I accumulated, the more inflammatory that would be. And then the more insulin resistant I would become. So it's a sort of vicious cycle. And the way at it is just essentially aligning with the way that our body is engineered. So for me, I stopped committing carbicide, right? So I began
Carboside.
yeah, I adopted initially sort of a ketotarian diet, candidly, which was kind of highly focused on kind of leafy green vegetables and fiber, et cetera, but kind of low glycemic index. And then I started to kind of bring more fish and regenerative meat into it, but essentially low carbohydrate, low refined sugars and refined grains and starches, et cetera. And then mixing that, stacking that with an 16-8 intermittent fasting protocol, right? So I was condensing my consumption of calories into an 8-hour window, and that was helping to essentially give my pancreas a break, but also I started to see better blood sugar levels, and then I started to layer in cold therapy cadenced at a very, very particular time of day. And I'd love to get your input on this because I can understand it physiologically to a certain level, but your expertise, I think, would lend some sort of additional color to it. So I reduced the amount of carbohydrates I was ingesting. Then I would be, let's say, 15 and a half hours fasted. So maybe like 10 a.m., 10:30 a.m. in the morning. And then before I put my first bite of food in my mouth, I would submerge in, let's say, like a 55-degree ice plunge, 50-degree ice plunge. So what would happen? Gasp, right? And then, and then my body would try to go to would thermoregulate. So it would engage in thermogenesis. So my body would need to make heat. So it would look around for a substrate for the process of thermogenesis. But because I was eating very little carbs and I was 15 and a half hours fasted, there wasn't a lot of glucose around. So what option did it have? It essentially had to break triglycerides down. It had to break oxidized fat for the use of those free fatty acids at the mitochondrial level for the production of heat to bring my body back into that Goldilocks zone. And this is the time where I just could see the weight shed. I mean, I was 210 and I went down to 142.
Wow.
So, and this was really just through stacking those particular protocols. Now, subsequently, through more protein consumption and some more resistance training, I put on some good muscle. So I'm more in the 165 range or something now, which feels really good for me. But it was the interesting stacking of those good stress protocols that really helped me sort of reset my metabolism and completely tame the wild tiger of my blood sugar.
This is such good stuff because I know that many of you people out there watching this podcast have issues with blood sugar regulation. Here are the keys, to make it happen. And it's not just blood sugar regulation. We're talking about all manner of metabolism, with respect to that excessive layer of fat or the elevated blood fats, hypertension, whatever it may be. I want to just comment on something earlier that has stuck in my mind. I just want to move it to the side, and that is as we go down the path of insulin resistance, our pancreas works overtime, creates higher and higher levels of insulin, and ultimately, it's not a question of having not enough insulin; it's just not working anymore, and that's when the blood sugar then goes up because insulin's not doing its job. It's so puzzling to me that in that situation, doctors will prescribe a drug called insulin. So giving even more insulin at a time when the actual insulin levels are already high, but it's not working, but force the issue even further by giving insulin. Still very commonly used, even in type 2 diabetes. I understand it in type 1, but
Sure.
I sure don't get it in type 2 diabetes. And let me comment on the notion of then when you should eat as it relates to the cold plunge. And I think after the cold plunge is reasonable because what you're emulating there is a significant physical stress, which if you think about it in terms of ancestral physiology, is what we would have to endure in order to get food. Right? You'd have to chase the animal, or you have to jump in the cold, whatever, or you'd have to become overheated and cross the desert. So I think an adaptation is one that sets the stage then for uh, taking in nutrients, including carbohydrate and protein, following the experience and the recovery then from that stress. That's when our bodies, I think, anticipate gaining nutrition. So I think what you're doing seems appropriate from that
Yeah.
perspective. I'd be interested in what Dr. Sachin Panda would have to say with that as it relates to chronobiology.
Yeah.
We don't have a heck of a lot of time left, but I do want to talk about your discussion on light and using various forms of, dare I call it, light therapy. It wasn't therapy in the day, it was just what was there, right? But how does light then enter into our discussion?
Well, sure. Of course, if you once again ask yourself that question, how did I evolve? Well, we evolved immersed in nature. Many of us on the Serengeti slept outside or in very, very simple huts, and we had exposure to early morning light, right? So, early morning light, as it's been proved out, is absolutely central to our circadian rhythm. So, like almost everything in human physiology, there is a crest and trough. There is this, as you say, dynamic homeostasis. Cortisol often gets a bad PR agent thrown at it, but cortisol can be very, very adaptive as a hormone. It gets us out of bed and makes us alert and functional. But our problem right now is that there's a tremendous imbalance of cortisol, where we're in a chronically cortisol infused state, many of us, and that is not balanced through the kind of appropriate production and secretion of melatonin. So, getting early morning light has a certain response in the human body, again, adaptive, especially when the light is within that very blue light range of around 480 nanometers, which is kind of just a little sliver of the electromagnetic wave spectrum. And we can receive that light from the superior field, kind of up here, into the inferior part of our retina. There's these specialized neurons there called, I think, intrinsically sensitive retinal ganglion cells. And they send a signal kind of down to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is sort of this timekeeper of the body, which sends another signal to the pineal gland, which produces melatonin right around 12 or 14 hours later, which of course is exactly when we would want it if we were going to get a good night's sleep, because melatonin is, of course, a hormone and an antioxidant, which is another conversation, but it is a hormone that induces grogginess. So getting good morning light, 20 minutes of light, let's say, particularly like on a clear day, will help to set that circadian rhythm to ensure that we are on the proper hormonal teeter-totter, if you will, and that cortisol is balanced with melatonin. Of course, now, because we are addicted to our screens. And of course, I love to indulge in Curb Your Enthusiasm or any kind of brilliantly. I just watched this miniseries called Fauda on Netflix, which is just
Called
really
what?
fast. It's called Fauda. It's actually shot in the West Bank um, in Israel. It was a very, very interesting series. And you get addicted to watching these shows, and there's so much wonderful entertainment and very educational entertainment around. And I understand the temptation, but our 24/7 access to entertainment and to all of the blue light emitting screens is disrupting this dynamic homeostasis between cortisol and melatonin. So this is why it is so important to get early morning light, because we exist in relation to this circadian rhythm. Now, at many latitudes, it's not possible to get early morning light. So we can simulate that with these what are called SAD lamps, which often address, I think they were found or innovated to address seasonal affective disorder, which is more of a depressive condition. But they can also serve as blue light in the morning. If you get these SAD lamps, are like about 10,000 lux, right? And you can sit, for 20 minutes, about 12 to 14 inches away from them. And that will simulate the morning light, which will, activate the same kind of circadian mechanisms. So this is why, and of course, like, I'm sure you've had many, many sleep experts on your show, but sleep for me, particularly, and I think for so many people, was my Achilles heel. And it is absolutely foundational to health. I mean, obviously, memory and the lymphatic system that helps to sort of clean up um, your brain while you're sleeping. But really, you just know by dint of your own experience, you do not make good decisions when you're sleep deprived. You often eat comfort foods. It's much more difficult to get a proper workout. So this is why getting that good morning light, that light therapy, is essential, is foundational to health.
Well said. I want to close just with a comment and hear your response, and it deals with whole milk. I don't know why whole milk is suddenly a political issue, but I think it enters into our discussion of stress in that whole milk contains a lot of things that do tend to stress the consumer a bit in terms of immunity in a good way. We see the data indicating a significant reduction in allergies, for example, in children, atopy, and in kids who are consuming whole milk, not just because of the fact that it may contain bacteria, but other things, immunoglobulins, et cetera. And yet, we want our milk to be sterilized, pasteurized, homogenized, and every other eyes that you can imagine. And, I understand that contaminated milk can be life threatening, but I just would love your views in terms of this whole ongoing, very obvious debate right now in terms of should we have access to drinking whole milk? And if so, what might be the upside?
Mhm. Are you specifically talking about like raw whole milk?
Raw, unprocessed milk
Just
out of the
yeah,
cow into the bottle and off you
sure.
go.
Yeah, well, um, just a disclaimer: Schuyler, my wife, ran a sort of underground raw milk co-op, and in Brooklyn when we lived there, and every Saturday morning we would receive there would be an unmarked white van coming from Amish country in Pennsylvania, and and you know, two guys probably on, what do they call it, Rumspringer. They would hop out of the back, and we would, carry in these illicit cartons of raw milk, and it was actually very raw milk and kefir and other yogurts and dairy, etc. And then we would house them in our apartment, and then across the course of the day there would be pickups, and it was like the most like hippie alt lefty nose ring tattooed people on one side, and then it would be the Hasidic community on the other side. It was so interesting. We would have both groups in our apartment kind of sifting through their order. So it's a little bit of a disclaimer, that we've been involved in some raw milk, illicit distribution of raw milk. Yeah, I mean, like anything, I think there's a sort of risk benefit analysis to be done. I mean, yes, certainly there is some risk, though I have looked at the data around that. And, the hospitalizations due um, to kind of bacterial contamination of raw milk is like, since the mid 90s, is like in the hundreds, you know so
Yeah.
it's very small. Now, I do believe that in kind of earlier times, in the early 1900s, that raw milk can actually transmit tuberculosis in very, very rare cases, and tuberculosis is no joke, right? It's deadly, or can be deadly. So there is a risk there, but and this is where I would say that if you're going to, and then obviously through homogenization, pasteurization, you're not going to get the shelf life. So this is where I think we really have to make really intelligent decisions. And if you want to avail yourself of the benefits, the bacterial benefits of raw milk, then get to know a local farmer and who you trust, and who is running a hygienic facility and is local, and have your raw milk. I mean, you can also get cultured milk products, and so that's sort of sometimes a balance for people, because you can avail yourself of the probiotic bacteria
Right.
in
And
cultured
there's
milk,
actually some
while
good data on that, by the way.
and you can culture pasteurized milk products. So that for some people who don't want to take the risk, that's actually not a bad middle ground. um, but yeah, I mean, I would say you know that raw milk is probably best when it's purchased and consumed locally. And again, I don't have a big issue with it, but I understand that some people do.
Great. Well, Jeff, it's great to hang out with you and to see you. You look terrific. You look healthy, and I expect that to continue until you drink the bottle of, what is it, Margot?
Oh, Chateau Margaux. Yeah.
Yes.
This is I was introduced to Chateau Margaux by, I think, William Hearst of the Hearst family one day, and he was like, I was a young teen that I didn't know, Chateau Margaux from,
Ripple.
grocery store wine. Yeah. And he was like, this is what you want when you get to be my age. This is what you drink. I was like, okay, son. Yeah. So I always remember that.
So, Jeff, tell people where they can learn more about you and Schuyler.
Yeah, well, I stumbled across the goodstress.com URL, so I scooped that up. So if you're interested in the book and all of the protocols associated with really what helped turn my health around, you can go there. But I think what I'm most proud of is what we've been able to create at Commune. I mean, really, the thread of my life is building community and pulling incredible, brilliant people like yourself together. And so we've created a kind of 10-acre, oh God, laboratory, if you will, up in the hills of Topanga. And we've been so fortunate enough to host so many brilliant people up there and make great content. And all that content exists in a central repository called Commune. And so that's just onecommune.com. That's ONE commune.com. And if you go there, you'll find, a course by Dr. David Perlmutter and Dr. Hyman and Dr. Bland and
Dr. Austin Perlmutter.
Dr. Austin Perlmutter and Sarah Gottfried and Casey Means and so many of the doctors that have really bent the arc of my personal journey. So that's the best spot. Thanks,
all right,
man.
my friend. Great to see you.
Yeah, love you. Thanks for all your generosity. Appreciate you.
Bye-bye for now.
Bye.
Wow, that was a great experience. What a wealth of knowledge, and what an impressive vocabulary Jeff has. I've always been impressed by that. His book, Good Stress, is really quite remarkable, and not only chronicles what he did to improve his health, especially from a metabolic perspective, but really gives us all some very, very powerful tools to really leverage this notion of good stress or hormesis in our day-to-day lives. Hope you enjoyed the program today. I'll be back soon. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. That's all for now. Bye-bye.